So today's demo is a human skull. There are a lot of neutrals here, and there's not actually a lot of color, so it'll be kind of challenging to be able to communicate all of the subtle shades and so forth using what I see here to be only 2 or 3 colors. I think I'm going to try and exaggerate some of the blues that I see here. They're kind of cool grays really, but I think I'll bump them over into more of the blue realm so that they'll be more interesting. And I'm just going to begin with a really light pencil drawing so that I don't have to figure all this out as I paint. So we'll start. My drawing will not have a whole lot of detail in it because that I will paint in. The drawing is really to just sort of give me the placement and proportional relationships of different things. think I've got it pretty much where I want it to be. So as I'm looking at the paper, I just kind of want to get an overall sense of what the values are, and the skull is darker than the paper, so I have to make the decision here. What do I want to do with the background? Do I want it to be lighter or darker than the skull? And I think in this case, I'm going to make it lighter so that the skull has more of a sense of volume. And it doesn't mean I'm going to leave it paper white, it just means that I'm going to make it darker than the background around it. So I think I'll start with a neutral sort of brown, somewhere in the beige family, and I'm just gonna fill in that skull with that light brown color, the beige. And I'm painting in the whole thing with that beige because I want all these colors to relate to each other. And if they have an underpainting color that goes through the entire thing, it helps to link the composition together nicely. So that's why that is happening. I think at this point too, I'm going to play around with those blues that I was talking about earlier. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put some of those blue tones on top of this beige where the shadows are, where I see them. And some of them are hard edged and some of them are soft, but I wanna do it on the wet paint so that everything blends together nicely. I don't have those hard edge shadows. The hard edge shadows I can go back and add when I do the wet into dry. Right now it's wet into wet, so everything's gonna be a little mushy, but that's what I want. So you start out light, you start out very broad, and then you gradually darken things, harden things. You go from soft to hard. So all these blues and things are kind of soft and mushy, so I paint those first and then build on top of it. For this blue, it's sort of a light ultramarine mixed with just a hint of violet, because I wanted a sort of purplish blue to work with here. If I want, I can go ahead and do the shadow on the tabletop as well and have that sort of mush into the bone of the skull, and then I can I can add harder edged versions of that later, but for right now I can just do a really loose kind of shadow underneath. I have overhead lights, fluorescence, so I've got several light sources which are going to result in several different shadows laying on top of each other. And that's fine too. You always start with the lightest shadow, let that dry, then you can add a layer on top of it. It's pretty fun. And while this is drying, I'm just gonna add a few little accent colors, and I'm kind of seeing a little bit of a purple, so I'm going to add purple little shadows. Even though it may not be exactly purple, as the artist, you have the opportunity and the prerogative to change colors to make a better painting. That's the end result that you want. That's the priority, is to get a good painting out of this. So if you have to fudge nature a little bit to make that happen, then so be it. And again, I am just very gradually building these layers up. If I get into a spot and I realize, I don't want that to be that dark, that's when I can get my Kleenex and just go in and pull a little bit of that paint back out if I want. I'm not worried with precision so much on this particular painting because I want it to be more expressive. Since it's a human skull, I like it to have a little bit of romance to it because it's got a heavy history of mysticism and folklore and symbolism and that sort of thing. So I'm just kind of thinking, how can I communicate sort of the history of what this represents? So that's why I'm deciding these things as I go. I still want there to be some immediacy to it and some spontaneity and some energy, so I don't want to overwork it too much. As I'm looking at the skull, I see that top outer edge is pretty dark and defined, so I'll go ahead and while this underpainting is wet, I'll go ahead and add some of those darker colors on top, just to define the edge a little bit. And I'm not in a hurry. I can take my time on this and do it as gradually as I want. This whole process is very meditative. We're supposed to think about what we do and consider things and slow down. So I don't have a problem with being very slow and deliberate. It's one of the nice things about painting, is that you can get your brain to that place where you don't have to decide things. You can just kind of run on autopilot for a little bit. This area inside the skull is pretty dark. So I'm going to paint what I see. I'm just going to paint this super dark shape. Paint around the teeth. Whatever's left will be the teeth. So I'm painting those teeth with negative shapes. not fighting the water. I'm trying to work with the water. I know that it wants to bleed into other areas, so I'm trying to take advantage of that, like the shadow inside the eye socket. I know that it wants to be really dark right along this edge, so I'm going to dry the outer edge a little bit so it doesn't bleed too much. And then I can get darker paint and just sort of set it in there, and it will go to wherever the edge of that wet water is, as opposed to the dry water. The wetness of the water, it will stop at the edge. So I know it will do that, and I can use that to my advantage when I'm trying to make things work. A smaller brush now. Start to get a little darker as I am progressing. There's only one little spot I see that's actually black, so I will paint that last. It's right here inside this eyeball. some of my edges are still a little wet for me to go into, so I'm going to speed it up with a hair dryer for a bit. So as I'm drying, I know that when the paper stops shining from the water, then that area is dry. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. I dry it at an angle so that I can see the reflection. And when the water doesn't shine anymore, then it's good to go. This is much better with good dry paper. I can get really good crisp edges here where I want them. So right here, I want this to be a little bit of a gradient, so I'm darkening the edge, and then I'm going to go back with just clear water, paint into the eye socket a little bit, and then let that water touch that harder edge, and it'll give me a nice subtle gradient as it goes into the socket. Getting close, almost there. Just waiting until the very end before I put my super dark blacks on. The shadow inside is darker the closer it is to the skull, and then gets lighter towards the bottom. So I'm just going to put these darks in the top part of the shadow, and then the bottom part, again, I'll use clear water and just barely touch it into this ink or watercolor paint that I've already laid down, and it will blend itself. Just like my colors, I start off light and gradually get darker. I do the same with my brush strokes. I start off with large, more washy sorts of strokes, and then I use this small detail brush at the very end to just kind of define the edges of things just a little bit more. So large to small, light to dark. These little bleeds I got in the paint here are pretty cool because they kind of match up to the sutures in the skull. They have that same sort of meandering line quality to them. I like that. So that was a little happy accident. You can also lay some color in certain spots if you want to. And then if you don't want it to be so dark, just barely blot it with your tissue a little bit. Pull some of that paint back out, and it'll be more of a subtle transition instead of a hard edge. And that's that.